The conference room smelled like dry erase markers and the particular stale coffee that sits in a pot too long when nobody wants to be the one to make a fresh batch. My father had called me down like it was a retirement party. My brother sat beside him in a suit that still had the crease marks from the store. I thought we were there to talk about Grandpa Otto's old patents, some estate cleanup, maybe finally getting the succession plan on paper the way Dad had been promising for 2 years. We were not. I sat down in one of those hard rolling chairs with my hands folded in my lap, and I watched my father arrange his face into something businesslike, and some old animal part of me went quiet and alert, the way it does when a room feels wrong before you can say why. What none of them understood, sitting there under those fluorescent lights, was that 5 years later, I would be the one signing the papers that decided whether that company still had a name on the door at all. Welcome back to Hidden Family Revenge, where the ones who get written off turn out to be the ones holding everything up. If your family ever measured you by a title instead of what you actually built, this one's for you. Drop a comment and make sure you're subscribed before we get into it. My name is Marianne Kessler. Everyone but my family called me Mari. I was 33 that October, and I still believed, foolishly, that showing up counted for something in a family like mine. Kessler Precision Tooling had been our name on a building for 60 years. My grandfather started it in a 2-bay garage with a single lathe and a stubbornness that apparently only skipped 1 generation, because it landed square in me. I'd worked that floor since I was 14, sweeping metal shavings for gas money, then running the CNC machines through college, then managing client relationships nobody else wanted to deal with because I was the only one who'd actually pick up the phone when a job went sideways at 11 at night. My brother Todd worked there too, technically. Mostly he sat in on meetings in a shirt that cost more than my first car and nodded along with whatever our father said. He wasn't stupid. He just wasn't there the way I was there. He'd never once stayed late to fix a die that was throwing off tolerance, never once talked a panicked client off a ledge at midnight. But he had our father's face and our father's last name spoken with our father's exact inflection, and in my family, that had always counted for more than sweat ever did. The lawyer slid a folder across the table. Not toward me, toward Todd. I remember thinking, almost calmly, that it was strange they'd bring in outside counsel just to talk about retirement timing. Dad didn't do things halfway, though. He never had. If he was going to hand off the company, he was going to do it with a signature and a room full of witnesses, the same way he did everything that mattered to him, carefully, and in a way that made sure nobody could argue with it later. The lawyer read through it in that flat, careful voice people use when they know exactly how much weight the words are carrying. Full transfer of ownership, all voting shares, the building, the equipment, the client contracts, the whole operation. Call it $6 million on paper, though the real number didn't matter to me in that moment, nearly as much as the name attached to it. Todd Richard Kessler. Then a second clause, and my father didn't slow down to soften it any more than the lawyer had. My daughter Marianne receives no ownership interest in Kessler Precision Tooling, effective immediately. I heard it twice before it landed anywhere real. My mother watched me the whole time it was being read, the way you watch for a crack in a dam. When it didn't come, when I just sat there, hands still folded, breathing steady, she leaned back in her chair with something that looked almost like relief. My father was the one who finally said it, not cruelly. That was the part that took the floor out from under me. He said it like he was stating a fact he'd been sitting on for years and was finally, mercifully, allowed to say out loud. You were never cut out for this family. The coffee maker gurgled in the corner. Nobody at that table said a single word in my defense. Not Todd, who at least had the decency to look at his hands. Not my mother, who had clearly been waiting years for someone to finally say the quiet part. I asked, quiet and even, if I could see the documents myself. My father hesitated a half-second too long before he nodded to the lawyer, who turned the folder so I could read it. I scanned it once, twice, looking for something, anything, that might have been a mistake, a placeholder, a draft. It wasn't. The signature page was dated 8 months back. This hadn't been decided in the heat of an argument or in a single hard week. My parents had sat with a lawyer 8 months ago and built this, word by word, and then waited for a Tuesday when everyone could be gathered around a table to make sure I heard it read out loud. I understood the whole room in a single breath. Nobody there was going to say my name kindly. Not the lawyer, who worked for them. Not Todd, who I don't think even wanted this. Not really, but who had never once learned how to say no to our father. Not my mother, who had been waiting for this exact moment since I was maybe 12 years old. There was nothing left in that room for me. So I stood up. I didn't beg. I didn't raise my voice. I'd learned a long time ago that begging in that family just handed somebody a stick to hit you with later. I looked at the folder, at the pen laid out in case there was anything left for me to sign, and there wasn't. "Okay," I said. "Then there's nothing here for me." My mother's chin lifted, satisfied, like I'd finally confirmed something she'd always suspected about me. I picked my keys up off the table. Todd said my name once, soft, almost a question. I didn't turn around. If I'd turned around, I would have had to watch him not follow me out, and I didn't have room in me for that, on top of everything else. I walked out through that stale coffee smell and into a gray October parking lot, and the door clicked shut behind me like a period at the end of a sentence somebody else had written for me. I got in my car. I didn't start it. My hands were shaking now, finally, now that nobody was left to see them do it. And sitting there, gripping a steering wheel in an empty lot, one thought rose up over everything else, and I'm not proud of it even now. Someday, I told myself, I'm going to build something so big they can't pretend I was never cut out for anything. That was the poison, already working its way in. Not the money. The wanting to be seen by the exact people who'd just proven, in writing, with a lawyer present, that they never would be the ones to see me. I just didn't know yet how long it would take to figure out the difference between building something for myself and building something to finally make them look. Here's the thing my father never once said out loud in that conference room. For 3 years before he finally got around to that folder, when Grandpa Otto's hands had gotten too unsteady to run the floor, and his memory came and went like a radio caught between stations, I was the one who drove out every single weekend to help hold Kessler Tooling together. I was the one who caught it when the old scheduling software started dropping orders and nobody else noticed until a client called furious about a shipment that never left the dock. I was the one who sat with our biggest account for 6 hours the night their line went down, walking their plant manager through a fix over the phone at midnight, because Todd had already gone home and Dad wasn't picking up. I learned the names of every machinist's kids. I learned which suppliers would bend on a deadline if you asked the right way, and which ones needed to hear it from a Kessler directly, and I made sure it was always me who made those calls, because somebody had to, and it was never going to be Todd. Todd was 3 states over some of those years, building his own resume at a bigger firm, and I never once blamed him for that. Genuinely, I didn't. But when the final accounting came due, when it was time to decide exactly what each of us was worth on paper, the one who'd been holding the floor together for years got called not cut out for this family, and the one who'd shown up mostly for holidays and shareholder meetings got handed the keys to the whole building. Nobody in that room thought that was strange. That was the family I grew up inside. My grandfather used to say something to me out on that shop floor, back when I was maybe 10, sweeping shavings into a dustpan twice the size of my arm. He'd rest one hand on the old lathe, like it was a horse he trusted, and he'd say, "A business remembers who ran it, Mari, not whose name is on the door." I didn't understand what he meant back then. I thought it was just something old men said to keep young girls sweeping without complaining. After his funeral, 2 years before all this, before the folder, before the lawyer, before any of it, his old partner, my Uncle Walt, had pressed a battered metal toolbox into my arms in the parking lot of the funeral home. Said Otto had set it aside for me a long while back, before his mind started slipping, and that Walt had been keeping it in his own garage ever since, waiting for the right time to hand it over. Papers, mostly, from the weight of it. I put it in the back of my closet in my apartment, and I didn't open it. I told myself I'd get to it when I was stronger. What was sitting inside that toolbox would have changed the entire shape of the next 5 years if I'd only looked sooner. I didn't. It waited for me in the dark, same as it always had. So instead, I made a decision, and for once it was fully mine. No more driving down on weekends, no more calls that ended with me smoothing over how a conversation had made my mother feel. I closed the door on Kessler Tooling, and I turned the lock myself, from my side, for the first time in my whole life. I moved 40 minutes away to a rented townhouse outside Dayton, and I did not look back. Or I told myself I hadn't, which turns out to be an entirely different thing, and I wouldn't learn the difference between the two for a long time yet. I kept working, because that's the only thing I've ever really known how to do with grief. I'd been quietly building relationships in industrial automation on the side for a couple of years already, small consulting jobs, helping shops retool their processes when they couldn't afford a big firm to do it for them. I threw myself into it entirely, took on more clients than I could reasonably carry, said yes to work at midnight, so I wouldn't have to sit still with the empty part of me that kept asking why I hadn't been enough. One night, a few weeks after the funeral, sitting alone in that townhouse, with a stack of case files I didn't need to open yet, I finally pulled the toolbox out of the closet and set it on my kitchen table. It smelled like machine oil and my grandfather's cigars, and for a long minute I just knelt there on the floor with the lid in my hands and let that hit me, let it actually hurt, instead of pushing past it the way I usually did. Then I made myself go through it the way I go through any client's records, piece by piece, careful, patient. Old patent filings from the 60s and 70s, some of them for tooling processes Kessler hadn't used in decades but that Grandpa had quietly kept the rights to. A handwritten client list going back to the company's earliest years, names of small manufacturers who'd stuck with Kessler since the beginning out of loyalty more than anything, contacts nobody currently at the company even remembered existed, tax records, old blueprints with corrections marked in soft pencil in the margins, and at the very bottom, in a plain envelope with my name written across the front in Walt's careful, old-fashioned hand, a letter. He'd written it not long after Grandpa Otto passed, back when he still had the strength to sit down and get it all out. My hands were steadier holding that envelope than they'd been on the steering wheel in that parking lot. He knew. That was the very first thing the letter told me. No lead-up at all. He knew Dad was planning to hand the whole company to Todd eventually, and he knew exactly why, and he believed with his whole stubborn heart that it was the wrong call. He was too old and too tired to fight my father on it directly the way he might have 30 years earlier, so he did the only thing he had left in him to do. He didn't leave me stock or a claim on the company. He knew that would only drag me into a fight over a deed I'd never win outright, not against a father who'd already made up his mind. He left me knowing instead. He wrote out, in that careful hand, the details of an old manufacturing process Kessler had patented decades back, and then quietly let go stale, a precision technique that, updated with modern automation, could undercut half the competitive bids in the region. Something only somebody who understood both the old floor and the new technology could ever actually use. And beneath that, a name. A supplier relationship going back to the company's earliest days that nobody currently running Kessler even knew still existed. One that could be the backbone of an entirely new operation if the right person ever thought to call it. At the bottom, his handwriting thinner now, worn down at the edges, he'd written one line I have never once managed to get out of my head. "You'll know what to build, kid. You're the only one who ever cared about the work, not the name on the building." I read that line 4 times before I could set the letter back down. The work, not the name. He'd seen the whole family in a single sentence. 60 years of us. Everyone fighting over whose name sat on the door. Over titles. Over the $6 million number typed at the top of a legal filing. And not one of them, except Walt and my grandfather, had ever actually cared about the thing itself. The machines, the floor, the people who ran it, except me, and he'd left me the only thing on earth that could actually let me build something real, not to hand me a claim on Kessler tooling. To give me the one tool nobody else in that family would ever know how to use. I could put the lid back on that box and slide it into the dark of my closet and let it sit there the way I'd let it sit for 2 years already. Or I could pick up the phone. I picked up the phone. Not to call my father. Not yet, and honestly, not for a long time after that either. I called an old contact from one of my consulting jobs, a woman named Denise who ran a small automation shop outside Columbus and had been telling me for a year I ought to stop working for other people's companies and start my own. I didn't tell her about the letter. I didn't tell anyone about the letter. Not for years. I just told her I was ready to build something of my own. Finally, and I asked her if she still had that line on investment space she'd mentioned back in the spring. I hung up the phone and sat there at my kitchen table, with the toolbox open in front of me, the old patents and the client list, and my grandfather's steady, patient hand still somehow steering things from wherever he was now. I didn't know yet what any of it would become. I only knew, sitting there in that quiet kitchen, that I wasn't going back to Kessler tooling, not to beg for a seat at that table again. I was going to build something entirely my own, quietly, the way I'd always done everything that actually mattered, and I was going to do it without a single one of them watching. 5 years is a long time to stay quiet like that. It turned out it wasn't nearly long enough to stop caring what happened to that company. I just didn't know that yet either. I want to tell you it was a straight line from that kitchen table to anything resembling success, and it wasn't. The first 18 months, I ran the entire operation out of a rented unit in an industrial park that smelled permanently of cutting oil and drywall dust, with exactly one employee besides myself, a machinist named Ruben, who'd been laid off from a shop 2 towns over and was willing to take a chance on a woman with a laptop, a stack of my grandfather's old patents, and not much else. I called it Kessler Automation Solutions at first, which was a mistake I corrected fast. I didn't want the name doing any of the work for me, and honestly, I didn't want it drawing any attention back toward a family I'd spent real effort trying not to think about. I renamed it Meridian Precision within the year. Clean, forgettable, mine. The first contract we landed was small. A packaging plant 2 counties over needed a retrofit on an aging line, something that would have taken a bigger firm 3 months and cost them more than they could afford. I used Walt's old process, updated, modernized, run through automation software that hadn't existed when Grandpa Otto first patented it, and we did it in 3 weeks for a third of the price. Word travels fast in that world. Not fast like a viral video, fast like water finding the low ground, quiet and relentless, and impossible to stop once it starts moving. I worked past midnight, more nights than I didn't. I said yes to jobs I wasn't sure we could finish on time, because turning work away felt, some nights, like admitting my father had been right about me. I hired a second machinist, then a third. I stopped sleeping through most Sundays. I told myself this was just what building something looked like, and mostly, that was true. But some of it, I'll be honest with you, the way I wasn't always honest with myself back then, some of it was still that old poison from the parking lot, still there under the surface, telling me if I just built enough, worked hard enough, someday somebody from that family would have to look up and see it. I didn't let myself think about Kessler tooling directly. I didn't drive past their exit on the interstate if I could help it, even when it cost me 20 extra minutes on a trip I made twice a month for a client on the other side of the state. Sunburns you don't touch again even years after the skin's grown back over, and I genuinely believed, for a long while, that avoiding the exit sign counted as having made my peace with the whole thing. It didn't. Peace built on distance is really just avoidance wearing a nicer coat, and I hadn't learned that yet. I was about to. By year 3, Meridian had 11 employees and a client list that stretched from Ohio into Indiana and Kentucky. I'd stopped being the woman running numbers alone at a kitchen table and become, without quite planning it, someone other shop owners called when a piece of legacy machinery needed a modern brain grafted onto it. I'd become, in other words, almost exactly the kind of person I used to need, standing across a shop floor from me when I was 19 and in over my head. The irony wasn't lost on me. I chewed on it some nights, alone in an office that had my name on the lease and nobody's name waiting for me at home. I still hadn't opened the door on anything connected to my family. Todd and I hadn't spoken in going on 4 years by then. I heard things the way you always hear things about people you've cut loose, but never quite stop listening for. Through an old family friend at a wedding, through a mutual contact in the industry who didn't know any better than to bring it up. That's how I first heard that Kessler Tooling had lost its anchor client, a large auto parts manufacturer, the account that had made up nearly 40% of Kessler's revenue for over a decade, had pulled out and taken their contract to a competitor with better automation and faster turnaround. The kind of automation, as it happened, that companies like mine had been quietly installing across the region for going on 3 years. I didn't feel triumphant hearing it. I want to be honest with you about that, because it would be easy to tell you I did and let you cheer along with me. What I actually felt was something colder and more complicated. A kind of grim, unwanted recognition, like watching a slow-motion car accident you'd tried to warn somebody about years earlier and gotten laughed out of the room for. A few months after that, at an industry dinner I almost didn't attend, an old supplier named Carl, who'd worked with both companies over the years, leaned in over his drink and told me, in that particular tone people use when they think they're delivering gossip instead of a grenade, that Kessler Tooling was in real trouble. Overextended on a modernization loan, Todd had pushed through against our father's better judgment. Behind on payments to 2 of their key suppliers. My father's health wasn't what it used to be either, Carl said. Some kind of scare that winter. Nothing fatal, but enough to slow him down for good. I sat there with a glass of wine going warm in my hand and felt something crack open in me that I'd kept sealed shut for 4 years. Some ugly, honest part of me, the part I don't love admitting to, looked at all of it laid out plain in front of me and thought, quietly, and without much shame at all, good. If you've ever watched a family hand everything to the wrong person and call it a birthright, you already know exactly what that feeling is. Stay with me. It gets a lot more complicated before it gets anywhere close to fair. Subscribe if you don't want to miss where it turns. I went home that night and didn't sleep. Not because I was plotting anything yet, because for the first time in 4 years, I let myself actually think about that building, about the machinists whose names I still remembered, about the company my grandfather had built out of a 2-bay garage and a single lathe. I didn't know it yet, but the phone call that would change everything was less than a week away. The call came from a man named Frank Devereaux, who ran a small investment group I'd worked with twice before on distressed manufacturing deals. He had a habit of calling me whenever something in the industrial supply world was circling the drain, because he knew I could look at a shop floor and tell him in 20 minutes whether it was worth saving or better left to die quietly. "I've got a supplier chain out of Dayton that's about to go under," he said. 3 companies, all tangled up together. One of them's a tooling outfit, family-owned, old name, decent reputation, terrible balance sheet. You know the area better than I do. Want to take a look before I pass on it? He didn't say the name. He didn't need to. I already knew. The way you know a storm is coming before the sky actually changes color. "Send me what you've got," I told him, and I kept my voice as flat and professional as I could manage, the same way I'd keep my voice flat with any client whose family drama happened to be sitting in the middle of a deal. I pulled the records that same afternoon, public filings, supplier disputes, the loan documentation Frank's team had already dug up. I did it exactly the way I'd do it for any distressed acquisition target, because facts on a page hold still and let you look at them without flinching, and God knows I needed something that wouldn't flinch back at me. What I found was worse than the rumor Carl had handed me over wine glasses at that dinner. Kessler Tooling wasn't just down 1 client. They were 3 payments behind to their largest remaining supplier, carrying a modernization loan that had funded equipment nobody on the floor had been properly trained to run, and quietly negotiating for a bridge loan against the building itself just to make payroll through the next 2 quarters. $6 million on paper, the exact number my father had once handed my brother across a conference table like a crown, and underneath it, nothing but debt stacked on debt, the oldest trap in manufacturing. A company asset-rich and cash-poor, bleeding out slowly while everyone involved kept insisting out loud that everything was fine. And they'd handed it to the one son who had never once had to build anything from nothing in his life, and called it a legacy. It wasn't a legacy. It was a company on a ventilator, with a ribbon tied around the machine. I sat with that for a long time in my office that night, the same wrestling match I'd had with myself once before, at a kitchen table with a toolbox open in front of me. One version of me, older now, harder earned, said, quite plainly, "Let it fall, they chose this." Dad looked me in the eye and told me I wasn't cut out for this family, and then handed the whole thing to someone who genuinely wasn't cut out to run it. That isn't cruelty on my part. That's just arithmetic finally coming due. The other version of me, quieter and one I trusted a good deal less, because she still wanted something, wanted to walk in and fix it and stand in a room while my parents finally understood exactly what they'd thrown away. And underneath both of those voices, so far down I almost couldn't make it out, a smaller, truer question. If you save it just so they'll finally be sorry, whose approval are you still down on your knees begging for? Even now, 5 years later, I didn't have a clean answer to that question. I still don't know that I fully do, but I called my attorney the next morning anyway. Her name was Denise Okafor, no relation to the Denise who'd helped me get Meridian off the ground, just a small, strange coincidence I never got around to mentioning to either of them. She'd built her practice on exactly this kind of deal. Distressed manufacturing acquisitions, the unglamorous, unsexy work of untangling companies that had over-leveraged themselves into a corner. She had zero patience for anyone's family drama, including, thank God, her own. I laid the whole thing out for her over the phone and then again in person, because she made me say it to her face before she'd agree to touch it. The plan wasn't complicated in its mechanics, only in its emotional weight. Meridian, through a holding company, would acquire the distressed supplier chain Frank had flagged, which included 2 smaller firms Kessler depended on for critical components, and in doing so, gain enough leverage to structure a buyout of Kessler Tooling itself. Not a hostile takeover, a clean one. Debt restructured, jobs on the floor protected, the equipment modernized properly this time, by people who actually knew how to run it. And critically, this was the part I insisted on, the part Denise raised an eyebrow at but didn't argue. My name wouldn't need to appear anywhere the family could see it. Not at first. The holding company would carry the deal. Kessler Tooling would simply wake up one day with new ownership, better terms, and a lifeline nobody in that family would ever have to know came from the daughter they'd written off in a conference room 5 years earlier. Denise set her pen down and asked me the only question that actually mattered. "You're sure you can do this, and not need them to ever find out it was you?" I told her yes. I even believed it, sitting there in her office with the afternoon light coming in low through the blinds. That was the one part of the plan I hadn't actually tested yet. We moved fast, because distressed deals don't wait around for anyone's feelings to catch up. Frank's group closed on the supplier chain within 6 weeks, financed largely through Meridian. That gave us direct leverage over 2 of Kessler's most critical component lines, leverage I used, through Denise, to open a formal acquisition conversation with Kessler's board, which by then consisted of exactly 3 people. My father, weakened and increasingly absent from day-to-day decisions, my brother, technically the majority shareholder and entirely out of his depth, and an outside CFO they'd brought in 18 months earlier who could see the numbers plainly, and, I suspect, had been waiting for exactly this kind of lifeline to appear. The offer went through Meridian's holding entity, dressed up precisely as what it was on paper, a legitimate acquisition offer from a regional automation firm looking to expand into precision tooling, with financing terms considerably better than anything Kessler was going to find from a bank at this point. No name anywhere on the paperwork that meant anything to a single person in my family. Denise structured it clean and formal, sent from an address that told them absolutely nothing. Then there was nothing left to do but wait. And if you've been with me through the earlier parts of this story, you already know how I am at waiting. I gave it 4 days to see whether a family too proud to admit it was drowning would still reach for a rope thrown by a stranger. They reached for it. Of course they reached for it. There was a payroll clock ticking down that nobody could stop with pride alone, and my father was too tired and too sick to fight it the way he might have 15 years earlier, and my brother, to his credit, I'll say this for him, was scared enough for the people on that floor to swallow whatever was left of his ego and take the deal seriously. The CFO recommended acceptance within 2 weeks. The board voted 3-0. Kessler Precision Tooling signed a letter of intent to be acquired by an entity called Meridian Holdings, and not one person on that side of the table had the faintest idea that the woman who'd once been told she wasn't cut out for the family was the one holding the pen on the other end. I sat in my office the night the letter of intent came back signed, and for the first time in 5 years, I held my family's entire future steady in my 2 hands, and none of them knew my name was anywhere near it. I know what you might be thinking right now. Why help them at all, after everything? Hold on to that question. I need you to sit with it a little longer before we get to the room where it all comes apart. Comment below if you think you'd have made the same call, and subscribe, because the part where it finally surfaces is coming next. For a few weeks, the deal moved through due diligence exactly the way clean deals are supposed to. Quietly, on schedule, without drama. The debt got restructured. The supplier relationships stabilized. Kessler Tooling was, for all practical purposes, saved. And I told myself that was supposed to feel like enough. It didn't, not entirely, and the part of me still awake at 2 a.m. knew exactly why, even if I wasn't ready yet to say it out loud to anyone but myself. There was still one document left to sign, the one that couldn't be routed through a holding company. The one that would put my actual name, in plain type, on record as the new majority owner of Kessler Precision Tooling. And once that was signed, there'd be no version of this left where nobody ever found out who'd been standing behind the curtain the whole time. The final closing documents required a majority shareholder of record listed by full legal name in the state filing. The kind of public paper trail that anyone with a reason to look could pull up on a county clerk's website in about 4 minutes. There was no holding company clever enough to hide behind for that particular signature. No intermediary address from nowhere. If I signed it, Marianne Kessler went into a public filing tied permanently to the new ownership of Kessler Precision Tooling, and the entire quiet architecture I'd spent months building could come apart the moment anyone in that family thought to go looking. I sat with that single page in front of me on my desk for a long time one night, well past midnight, the office dark and quiet around me, except for the hum of the vending machine down the hall. Sign it, and the deal was finished. Clean, final, the jobs on that floor protected for good. Don't sign it, and I'd have to walk away from the one part of the deal that actually made it real, and watch the whole thing potentially unravel in some other buyer's hands. Or worse, watch Kessler Tooling limp along another year before finally going under anyway. There's no version of caring about something that stays clean all the way to the end. I understood that now, in a way I hadn't fully understood it, the night I first opened Uncle Walt's toolbox. I signed it. I'd love to tell you it was some hard, noble, chin-up decision, the kind you'd want to imagine yourself making in a moment like that. The truth is simpler, and it cost me something real to admit it to myself. When it finally came down to keeping myself safely hidden, or actually finishing what I'd started. Finishing it won easily, without much of a contest at all, and that told me plainly which of the 2 things I'd actually been building this whole time. A rescue, or a hiding place. Uncle Walt hadn't left me that letter so I could protect my own pride from a family that had already made its choice clear. He'd left it so the company would still be standing long after all our small, stubborn opinions of each other stopped mattering. So I put my full legal name on the ownership line, Marianne Kessler, in blue ink, and I filed it, and I let it sit there in the public record where it would stay forever. I told myself, reasonably, that nobody in my family had ever once in their lives pulled up a county business filing for fun, which was true. But my brother was about to sit through a closing walkthrough where he'd be handed a stack of paperwork he'd never once thought to read that closely. It happened during the final transition meeting, of all the plain, unremarkable places for a life to turn over. The outside CFO, the one who'd actually pushed the board to accept the deal in the first place, walked Todd and my father through the closing package page by page, the way these things always get walked through, dense and gray, and mostly ignored by everyone in the room except the lawyers. Somewhere in the middle of that stack, on the ownership line, in plain black type, Marianne Kessler. He told me later he read it 3 times before it meant anything at all, that he actually looked up from the table, like there might be some other Marianne Kessler loose in the state of Ohio. And then, all at once, it landed. The mysterious investment group that had thrown them a lifeline out of nowhere wasn't a stranger at all. It was his sister, the one who'd walked out of a conference room 5 years earlier and never once come back, holding the whole thing steady the entire time from 100 miles away, asking for nothing in return. He called me that same night. I very nearly didn't pick up. I watched his name sit there glowing on my phone through 3 rings before I finally answered. There was no hello on his end, just his voice, cracked open and much younger sounding than I remembered it. "Was this you?" he said. "All of it. Meridian, the acquisition, the whole thing. Was this you, Mari?" I could have lied. I'd built an entire deal out of exactly that skill. But he was my brother, and whatever else had happened between us, he'd never once been cruel to me. Only weak in the particular way our father had trained him to be weak, and I was tired, bone tired, of hiding in the very moments I'd finally done something worth being seen for. "Yes," I said. "It was me." I stood there in my kitchen and listened to 5 years of a story quietly rearrange itself in the long silence on his end of the line. The golden sun and the disappointment, the crown and the exile, the whole careful architecture of our family turning over at once in the dark. The company was saved. But the secret was gone now, out of my hands entirely, and secrets in my family never once in my life stayed inside a single room for long. Todd was a whole mess of things at once on that call, and I let him work through every one of them without rushing him. Grateful first, almost incoherently so, then ashamed of how grateful he was. Then afraid, because I think some part of him already understood something I hadn't let myself sit down with yet either. "What do you want for this?" he finally asked. "What do you want back, Mari?" I understood, hearing him ask it in that small, careful voice, that he genuinely didn't know there was any other kind of answer a person could give. In our family, every single thing had a price, and a ledger, and a reckoning, waiting quietly at the end of it. Nobody had ever handed him a different kind of ruler to measure things by, any more than they had me. "Nothing," I told him. That was the whole point. The line went quiet a long moment. He didn't understand it. Couldn't have. Then he said the thing I'd been carefully not thinking about for days. "Dad's going to find out. You know he will. And Mari, when he does, he's not going to say thank you. You know that too." He was right, of course. My mother found out within the week, the way she found out everything, through some mixture of Todd letting it slip in a weak, grateful moment, and the CFO mentioning it a little too casually to someone who mentioned it to someone else, the way these things travel in a small industry where everyone's known everyone else's business for 30 years. It doesn't matter exactly how it reached her. What mattered was what it told me the moment she called. She wasn't grateful. Gratitude would have required her to admit, even privately, even just to herself in a quiet room, that she'd been saved by the very daughter she'd sat across a table from and called not cut out for the family. That arithmetic simply didn't compute anywhere inside her, so instead, she got busy rewriting the story. If the daughter she'd written off had somehow saved the company, then the story would have to become something else entirely. A stroke of corporate luck. A coincidence, a family somehow weathering hard times together, the way strong families always insist they do. She reached for the ruler one final time, trying to measure me back down to a size she could still hold comfortably in one hand. And that's when my attorney made a call of her own, the one that changed everything that came after. To finalize the transition cleanly, to put the ownership structure formally and permanently, beyond anyone's ability to quietly reframe it later, Denise picked up the phone and called my parents' attorney directly, on the record, and asked all of us to sit down at one table to finish the paperwork properly, together. The moment she set the phone back in its cradle, it was done, and it couldn't be undone. 5 years of total silence between me and that building ended with one call between two lawyers who'd never met. Whatever was waiting in that room, there was no version of my life left on the other side of it, where I quietly went back to being the daughter nobody bothered to mention at holidays. My name was on the company now, in the filing, in Todd's voice, soon enough in my mother's ear, and the whole town's coming gossip. They wanted me back at a table. Only this time, for the first time in my entire life, I was the one who'd called the meeting. It was the same building. I couldn't tell you if it was the exact same room, because they all smell exactly alike after a while. Stale coffee and dry erase marker, the precise smell that had been waiting for me the last time this family gathered to tell me what I was worth. My mother sat with her back straight as a fence post, pearls in place like armor. My father sat smaller than I remembered him. The winter's health scare had taken something out of him that hadn't come back. Todd wasn't seated between them this time. I noticed that the second I walked in. His chair had been pulled noticeably closer to my end of the table. Two lawyers, folders squared in front of them, and me, walking in on my own 2 feet, 38 years old now, holding nothing in my hands. Because for the first time in my life, I didn't need to be holding anything at all. Denise laid it out plainly, the way the other lawyer once laid out my exile. Flat, careful, like a weather report on a slow gray day. Kessler Precision Tooling was solvent again. Debt restructured. Supplier relationships stable. Every job on that floor protected. The building would keep its name on the door. Then she said that the person who'd quietly built the entire rescue, month over patient month, through a holding company nobody had thought to question, was sitting at the far end of the table. She said my name into that room the way you'd state a plain fact about the weather. Marianne Kessler. I watched it move slowly across their 3 faces like a shadow crossing a field. Todd already knew, and only looked down at his hands. My mother's jaw set hard, a small muscle jumping in her cheek, and my father, slow now, sick now, 68 years old, began, at last, to understand what he was actually hearing. "That's impossible," he said quietly, almost to himself, testing the words in a language he didn't speak. Denise kept going, laying out the last of the structure, and he said it again, louder, not arguing with her so much as failing to fit the shape of the thing through the door of his own understanding. That's impossible. The daughter they'd removed from everything with a signature and a room full of witnesses. The one he'd told, plainly, to my face, that I was never cut out for this family. And now that same daughter was the only reason the $6 million legacy he'd handed my brother still existed on this earth at all. He looked at me across that table, his eyes wet and old, and said it one final time, broken all the way down now. "That's impossible." It was the closest he'd come in 38 years to saying my name like it meant something to him. My mother recovered first, she always did. It was the great, terrible talent of her whole life. She folded her hands on the table and let the old, familiar warmth come back into her face by slow degrees, and pivoted the way only she knew how to pivot. "Perhaps," she said, "given everything, given how the whole family had pulled together through such a difficult stretch, it was finally time to make things right. Restore my name to the ownership. Put us all on the board together, side by side, the way it should have been from the very start." She offered it warmly, leaning forward like a gift she was pressing gently into my open hands. And there it was, laid out plain in the middle of the table, the exact thing the woman gripping her steering wheel in that parking lot 5 years earlier had wanted more than she'd wanted air. To be restored, to be seen, to be told out loud in front of witnesses that she belonged and always had. All I had to do was reach out and take it, and I finally saw the whole shape of my own life, clear as cold water, maybe for the first time. If I reached across that table and took the restoration, took a board seat, took my place back in the family they were suddenly so willing to offer me now that I'd become too expensive to keep ignoring, I'd be handing my mother the ruler right back, with my own 2 hands. She'd measure me kindly this time, yes, mark me down at last as good, as worthy, as finally belonging, but it would still be her hand on the ruler, and my worth would still be sitting there in her grip, hers to raise or lower whenever the mood took her. Praise from that hand was the same cage as blame from it. I'd simply never been offered the praise before, so I'd never seen the bars for what they were. I understood then that I had never actually wanted the company, or the money, or the seat at that table. I'd wanted, my whole life, to stop needing their eyes on me at all. And the only way left to stop needing it was to refuse it. Right there, in front of all of them, the one thing that would prove I truly didn't need it anymore. So I said no, quietly, the way I say everything that's ever mattered. I told them I didn't want a seat on the board, didn't want my name restored to anything. I slid across the last document Denise and I had drawn up in advance for exactly this moment, one that kept Meridian's ownership structure exactly as it was, transparent, permanent, mine, with Todd staying on as operational president, a real job he'd have to actually earn from here forward, not a gift wrapped in a bow. Keep the recognition, I told my mother, standing. I never needed it. I just needed to know I could walk out of a room like this one without needing it. Her composure cracked, but not into shame. It cracked into confusion, and then straight into something close to anger. Dramatic, she called it. A stunt. She genuinely couldn't understand, all the way down to the root of her, why anyone would refuse to be handed something. In the long ledger of her life, value had only ever flowed one direction, from the one holding the ruler down to the one being measured. She was still holding it, even then, white-knuckled, with nothing of mine left in the world to lay it against. Across the table, Todd was quiet, watching me with something that looked, for the first time in either of our lives, like actual respect. My father caught my sleeve as I passed his chair, his fingers weak against the fabric, shaking the way mine had shaken on that steering wheel 5 years back. His mouth worked, and no word ever quite came out of it. Decades of practiced silence too heavy to lift, even now, even at the very end of wanting to. He didn't get there. Some doors stay shut, even when the man behind them has finally decided, far too late, that he wants to open them and doesn't know how. But he reached. He'd never once done that before. I let him hold my sleeve one long second, and then I gently took it back, and walked out through that same coffee-smelling air into an ordinary afternoon that didn't care at all what had just happened inside. Kessler Precision Tooling is still standing, still running, still employing the people whose names I learned as a kid sweeping shavings off that floor. My mother tells a version of the story now, where the whole family pulled together to save it, and I let her have it, because I don't need the record straightened anymore to sleep at night. Todd and I talk regularly now, carefully, still working around a lifetime of ruler between us, but real, which is more than we ever had growing up under that roof. As for me, I went back to Meridian, back to my own quiet work, and somewhere in the year after, I noticed I'd stopped checking whether anyone was watching me do it. That was the real tell, the one that finally told me the truth. They spent years deciding what I was worth. I finally stopped asking them to check my math.